They were walking backwards through a country that no longer belonged to them. It was the last week of August, 1914. The road from Mons ran south into France, through villages whose names most of the men would never learn. 80 miles, 4 days. No sleep that anyone could honestly call sleep. The dust rose to the height of their knees and stayed there, and the heat did not break. Some of them, when they were old men, would say the sky did something in those 4 days that they could not name. They would not all agree on what it was. They would not always agree that they had seen it, but they would agree that something walked beside them on that road, and that they were grateful, even if they could not say why. The town was called Mons. The date was the 23rd of August, 1914. The British Expeditionary Force had landed in France only days earlier. They were a small army by the standards of that war, barely 4 divisions of infantry, 1 of cavalry, and Mons was the first place where they were asked to hold a line. The line was a canal. It ran through coal country, slag heaps and brick villages, on the scene between Belgium and the road south. Across the water was the German First Army. There were more Germans than the British had been told there would be. There were more Germans than the British had guns to count. The Second Corps held the center of the British position. Their commander was Lieutenant General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien. He was outnumbered. He knew it. He had known it before the first round was fired. He had also been a young officer at Issy-en-Lonnois, more than 30 years before, and he had walked away to that field when most of his comrades had not. He knew what a retreat could cost a man, and still be the right order. The British rifles were faster than the Germans expected. The infantry of the old army had been drilled to a standard of musketry that no one would see again in that war. For most of a long August day, the line at the canal held, and the German infantry coming forward in the open paid for every yard. Then the French armies on the British right gave ground, and the position at Mons could not be kept any longer. The order came down: withdraw. What followed, history calls the retreat from Mons. The men who made it called it other things, most of them not printable. They marched at night and slept in ditches by day. They lost weight, lost equipment, lost friends. They did not lose the army. By the first week of September, the BEF was still a fighting force, and the line had reformed, and the war had become the war we now know. That is the record. That is what the official histories say. That is the part where the documents do not tremble. It was in the days after Mons that the first whispers began. A soldier wrote home. He said he had seen something between his line and the Germans during the retreat. He did not put it in those words. He said there had been figures in the field. Bowmen, he said. Men in old armor, drawing strings against the air. Other letters followed. Some described angels, tall figures in white between the British rear and the advancing Germans, holding the gaps so the wounded could move. Some described a single man on a pale horse. Some described nothing more than a feeling, the way a child describes the room he is afraid to enter. A pressure on the back of the neck, a sense of being walked beside.
The letters traveled the way private letters travel. Some were copied out by hand, some were read aloud at family tables on Sunday afternoons, in front rooms in country towns, where the news from the front arrived a week late and was kept for weeks longer. Then parish magazines began to print them, small magazines with small circulations, the kind a vicar wrote himself on a Saturday evening, and a churchwarden ran off on a handpress in the back of a shop. By the spring of 1915, the spiritualist papers had picked the story up, and the story had begun to harden. The bowmen and the angels became the same figures, or different appearances of the same thing. The line at Mons had been held by the dead of Agincourt, said one telling, by St. George himself, said another, by a host whose names no living man could speak. A nurse named Phyllis Campbell wrote a book the following year, 1916, called Back of the Front. In it, she said she had spoken with French and British soldiers in field hospitals who described the figures themselves. She wrote with the calm authority of someone who had watched men die for 2 years and had no patience for invention. She did not give their full names. She did not need to. By then, the story did not need names. It needed only to be passed on. In the trenches, the men told the story to one another, and to the replacements coming up the line, and to the chaplains, and to the war correspondents, who wrote things down faithfully and asked few hard questions. The legend, by the middle of the war, had a shape that no single witness could account for. It had become a thing the army told itself in the dark, the way armies have always told themselves things in the dark. But before the parish magazines, before the spiritualist papers, before Phyllis Campbell sat down at her desk, there was a story in a London newspaper. Its author was a Welshman named Arthur Machen. He worked for the Evening News. The date the story appeared was the 29th of September 1914, 5 weeks after the retreat from Mons. The story was called The Bowmen. In it, St. George rides at the head of a host of ghostly Agincourt longbowmen, and they appear between the British line and the German advance, and they cut the German infantry down with arrows that leave no wounds. It is short, it is plainly written, it is fiction. Machen never claimed otherwise. But the story moved faster than its author could chase it. Within months, Machen began receiving letters from clergymen, from soldiers' relatives, from spiritualist editors, telling him that the events he had invented were real and that they had been confirmed in private testimony. Some of his correspondents accused him of plagiarizing what God had done. In 1915, Machen published a clarification. The bowman, he said, was a piece of fiction he had written at his desk in London. There had been no source. There were no real bowmen. He was the only origin he knew of. Almost a century later, a folklorist and historian named David Clark went looking for the original sightings. He worked the dates. He read the letters. He sorted them by when they were written, when they were posted, when they were first printed. He compared the language of the soldiers' accounts to the language of Machen's story, and he found in account after account the same rhythms and the same images. St. George, the bowman, the arrows that left no wound.
Almost all of them came after the 29th of September, 1914. Almost all of them came after Machen. The most likely explanation, Clark wrote in 2004, was that exhausted men had absorbed a story that was already in the air, and that the absorbing had done the rest. Fatigue, repetition, the kindness of a frightened mind to itself. He was careful in his writing not to call any of the men liars. He understood what tiredness can do to a memory. He understood that a story heard at the right moment can settle into a man as deeply as a thing he has actually seen. The British War Office never opened a formal inquiry into the Angel of Mons. There is no official file. There is no soldier the army ever sat down and asked. The army had a war to fight, and then a war to finish, and then a generation to bury. And the question of what its men had seen on the road from Mons was never one it could afford to take up. That silence is part of the record now. A small remainder of the accounts cannot be placed cleanly. A handful of letters whose dates are uncertain, a handful of memories collected long after the fact, from men who insisted they had seen what they saw before any newspaper reached them. They sit unattributed. They do not prove anything either way. They simply will not be sorted. That is the honest answer. We do not know whether any sighting predated Machen. We cannot prove that none did. The men who marched home from Mons saw something in those 4 days. They were too tired to name it cleanly. Some of them in old age kept the story exactly as they first told it. Some of them in old age said they were not sure any longer what they had seen and what they had been told. Both kinds of men had been at Mons. Both kinds of men deserved to be believed about their own confusion. The legend itself outlived almost everyone who could speak to it. It is older now than the men who marched, older than the men who first wrote of it, older than the writer who unintentionally gave it a shape. What remains is this: a retreat, a short story, a column of letters whose origins do not all line up, and a field somewhere south of Mons where the dust settled 112 years ago and no one was ever sent back to ask. I cannot tell you what they saw. Neither could they in the end. What I can tell you is that the road from Mons was real, the exhaustion was real, the kindness of a story to a frightened mind is real, and so sometimes are the things a frightened mind is shown. The record stops where the dust settles. I have learned to stop with it. If the unfinished histories haunt you the way they haunt me, there is another file, on the desk, waiting.